Now your ass is mine, and I'm guaranteeing you I'm gonna murder you. I'm letting you know that now. Because you know what? Josh might have played me, but bitch, I'm gonna play your ass out too. Watch.
The case played out like a real-life version of Mean Girls.
She is a ugly slut.
You're a fat bitch, and I'm going to kill you, I swear on my life. How do you account for that?
I don't. I was basically obsessed with the chase of it all.
Only this time, the rivalry and jealousy ended not in high school drama, but in murder.
Said it because I was upset, and truthfully, I wanted to scare her.
Oh, I'm gonna show you psycho.
I never had the intent on actually harming.
And I'm guaranteeing you I'm gonna murder you.
Well, maybe that's something that, one could dismiss as angry teenage banter, but not after you actually kill her.
The next piece of information that you need to know is that she is dead.
Oh my God.
All this over Josh?
I had a one-track mind.
Boys.
Yes, a boy. And at that point, I was just feuding with Sarah.
Two teenage girls fighting over one boy lead to one bleeding out on a suburban street in Florida.
You're in Pinellas Park. Okay, what happened? Rachel! Just found her.
And the other, Rachel Wade, convicted of murder.
Rachel deserves a life sentence, Your Honor.
For 16 years, she's always maintained it was self-defense, not murder, despite evidence to the contrary.
There was two sides to it, and I didn't go after her. I did what I could to avoid it.
Self-defense means you have no choice, right? But you had plenty.
You're right.
What did you do before you left your apartment?
I grabbed a knife.
It's not self-defense if you're out in the streets with a weapon.
Now, would she finally come clean?
Do you accept that you murdered Sarah?
You're in Pinellas Park. Okay, what happened? Rachel! Just found her. Okay, where's the body of the patient stabbed? I swear to God, this is... Right. Someone has got to come. This girl is on the ground, passed out. I don't know if she's alive. I don't know. You think she's passed out now? I don't know. She's like coming and going. Sarah, stay with us. Sarah.
Some stories begin with moments so ordinary you don't realize you're watching a life heading toward its last quiet hours. Sarah Ray Ludeman was just a teenager laughing with friends, driving with her music loud, holding on to simple dreams and the steady love of her family. No one thought the conflict around her was anything more than typical teenage jealousy. Two girls, one boy, and online arguments that looked small from the outside. But the MySpace posts, the shouting matches, the sharp voicemails, they were warning signs people didn't take seriously. And on that warm Florida night, Sarah stepped out of her house thinking she was walking toward clarity, not danger. The truth wouldn't surface until the courtroom speakers played a voice that changed everything. Some nights feel normal until the wrong car pulls into the driveway. 3 teenagers, 1 driveway, seconds that changed everything. It began with a phone call just after 9 p.m. on April 14, 2009, when Sarah Ray Ludeman's phone lit up with messages that made her chest tighten. Messages from friends telling her that Rachel was at a house in Pinellas Park, and that Josh was somewhere nearby sending mixed signals that only made things more confusing. Sarah stood in her room staring at her screen as notifications stacked on top of each other. Everyone talking at once. Everyone repeating what someone else said. Everyone pushing her toward a night she didn't realize would be her last. On the other side of that same phone noise, Rachel Wade was sitting at a friend's place on 110th Avenue North, pacing the small living room with a steak knife in her purse, a knife she later told police she grabbed for protection because words between the two girls had grown too heated over the last few months. Rachel had been exchanging messages with Josh that evening too, messages that only stirred the jealousy and confusion that had been building for weeks. One friend would later testify that Rachel snapped, "If she comes over here, I'm done with her," a line that echoed the angry voicemails she had left earlier in the week. Meanwhile, Sarah walked into the kitchen telling her friend, "I'm just going to find out what's going on. I'm tired of this back and forth." Her friend tried to slow her down, reminding her that this rivalry had already caused too many arguments, but Sarah shook her head and said softly, "I just want this over tonight." Within minutes, Sarah grabbed her keys, and the two girls' worlds moved toward collision. Sarah climbed into her friend's car, the headlights cutting through the warm Florida night air as they turned onto the main road. The ride wasn't frantic, it wasn't panicked, it wasn't reckless. Witnesses later said she didn't speed or run lights. There was only a steady, determined stillness about her, as if she believed this confrontation would finally clear the air. Her friend asked her if she was sure about going. Sarah gave a small nod and whispered, "I'm done with the drama. I'm just going to talk." She believed she was stepping into a conversation, not a tragedy. That quiet belief carried her through each intersection, each turn, each mile closer to the driveway where Rachel was waiting. The hum of the engine filled the car, and the only thing louder was the thought Sarah never said out loud, "This ends tonight." By the time Sarah's car turned onto the street, Rachel had already stepped outside. People at the house saw her pacing in the driveway, still holding the knife she had tucked into her bag earlier. She muttered to someone standing near her, "She better not show up here," a statement prosecutors later used to establish intent. The second Sarah's headlights swung across the yard, voices shot up around her. Witnesses described the sound as fast, overlapping, sharp. Two girls whose emotions had been stretched too thin for too long. Sarah's door opened, and she stepped out, taking only a few strides toward Rachel. She wasn't yelling. According to testimony, she simply said something close to, "Can we just talk?" But the moment was already too charged. Rachel's voice rose first, snapping back with, "You don't need to be here," repeating lines she had said in earlier confrontations. A neighbor listening from across the street said the argument lasted maybe 30 seconds. No time to calm down, no time to rethink anything. Just a burst of words and emotion and history that had been waiting for a spark. Then, everything sped up at once. Sarah stepped forward, hands by her sides, trying to close the gap between them. Rachel moved faster. 2 quick motions, 2 strikes. One knife piercing straight into Sarah's chest with a depth that the medical examiner later confirmed had gone directly into her heart. The second wound hit her shoulder. Sarah gasped, stumbled backward, and collapsed almost immediately, her knees hitting the driveway before her body followed. A witness shouted, "Oh my God, she's bleeding," while another ran forward trying to hold her upright. Police records show that one of Sarah's friends screamed into a phone, "She's bleeding, please hurry." The 911 operator tried to keep the caller calm, asking, "Is she breathing? Stay with her. Help is coming." But the girl on the ground was fading too quickly for reassurance. Porch lights flicked on up and down the street as neighbors stepped outside and froze at the sight of a teenager's life draining into the concrete. Footsteps pounded across the yard as people rushed toward Sarah, but there was only so much they could do. Witnesses described the sound of her breathing as shallow, then faint, then almost gone. One neighbor knelt beside her, whispering, stay with us, please." Rachel stepped back from the scene, clutching the handle of the knife before tossing it aside into the grass. According to testimony, she looked down at Sarah and whispered words that struck witnesses cold. "I'm done." No yelling, no shock, just a quiet sentence that carried more weight than she realized. Sirens grew louder, piercing the stillness that had fallen over the driveway. Officers arrived within minutes, but the silence in the group standing over Sarah told them everything. They were fighting against time they had already lost. As paramedics loaded Sarah into the ambulance, Rachel stood off to the side with her hands shaking, insisting, "She came at me. She came at me with the car. I didn't mean for this to happen." But none of the witnesses standing there agreed. They had seen the steps. They had seen the strikes. They had seen the collapse. And as the ambulance pulled away, the night air felt heavy with the truth no one wanted to say out loud. She never made it to the hospital alive. And Rachel walked away whispering one sentence witnesses would never forget. When officers pulled onto 110th Avenue North just minutes after the 911 call on April 14, 2009, they stepped out into a scene filled with confusion, shouting, and the raw shock of teenagers who had just watched something unfold far beyond their control. Rachel Wade stood only a few feet away, her hands trembling as she tried to explain what happened, telling officers, "She came at me. She tried to hit me with her car. while her voice cracked in a way that mixed panic with urgency. Paramedics had already rushed Sarah toward the ambulance, but officers could tell by the silence from the stretcher that things were far worse than anyone originally realized. A search through the grass revealed the steak knife, the metal still slick, confirming what witnesses had already said. And while Rachel tried to steady her breathing, friends around her were giving statements that didn't match her account, describing how Sarah had stepped toward Rachel on foot before collapsing seconds later. That contradiction would become the first red flag for detectives, a sign that the story unfolding in front of them wasn't lining up with what their eyes were seeing. As detectives began piecing together the timeline, they pulled phone logs, text history, and MySpace activity from the hours and days leading up to the stabbing. What they found didn't point to a sudden fight. Rather, it pointed to weeks of escalating tension, arguments, confrontations, and digital hostility that had been growing like pressure behind a sealed door. MySpace messages from both girls showed a rivalry pushed by jealousy and fueled by the inconsistent attention from Josh Camacho, who had been messaging both teenagers in ways that confused, angered, and emboldened them. Friends told detectives that they had been warning each other for days about how heated things had become. One message Rachel sent earlier that week said, "Tell your little girlfriend to back off," while Sarah had told friends she was tired of being played. Police also collected multiple voicemails saved by friends, messages full of sharp emotion and anger that no one expected would eventually become the centerpiece of a murder case. With each new piece of data, detectives realized they weren't looking at a moment of panic. They were looking at the ending to a conflict that had been spiraling long before either girl drove to that driveway. The turning point came when the state attorney's office obtained Rachel's voicemails left days before the stabbing, recordings so heated that prosecutors later described them as a window into intent. One of those voicemails captured Rachel's voice saying, "You better watch your back because I'm coming for you." Another contained the chilling line that would echo through the courtroom speakers months later, "I'm going to murder you." Detectives sat in a small interview room playing the recordings repeatedly, each playback shifting the tone of the investigation. They weren't listening to empty teenage threats. They were listening to documented hostility that matched the direction of the knife, the testimony of the witnesses, and the tension recorded in every message exchanged between the two girls. One detective later said, "The tapes told us more than anyone in that driveway could." The contrast between the emotional girl standing in front of them and the voice they heard in those recordings became one of the most powerful elements in their case. An autopsy performed the next morning brought even more clarity. The medical examiner confirmed that one stab wound had pierced Sarah's heart, entering with a downward and forward trajectory that showed force and direct motion. The second wound in the shoulder told a similar story, quick, intentional, and aimed with enough strength to break through the tissue. The findings didn't support a scenario where Rachel was pinned or cornered. Instead, they pointed to a forward lunge, consistent with witness testimony that Rachel had moved toward Sarah, not away from her. Detectives studied the diagrams carefully, tracing the angle of the wounds and the distance between the girls in those final seconds. The physical evidence stripped away speculation and centered the investigation on the sequence of actions rather than the emotions behind them. And for investigators, the wounds spoke as loudly as the tapes. When Rachel was brought back in for questioning, she repeated her claim that she acted in self-defense, insisting again that Sarah had tried to run her over and that she feared for her life. Detectives listened patiently, giving her space to explain her version, but the more she spoke, the more the contradictions grew. Witnesses said Sarah had stepped out of the car calmly, and the position of Sarah's body on the driveway did not match Rachel's description. Rachel's voice trembled as she said, "I didn't go after her. She came at me." But detectives had already gathered statements from multiple people who watched the encounter unfold in real time. The interrogation room became a place where two realities clashed, the one Rachel believed she was defending, and the one the evidence was steadily confirming. Every phone record, every message, every witness account kept pointing in the same direction, and detectives could feel the weight of what they were uncovering. By the end of the second day, the investigation had shifted into a case that prosecutors described as a timeline written long before the blade was lifted. Detectives leaned back in their chairs after assembling the final sequence of evidence: the messages, the threats, the forensics, the eyewitness testimony, and the autopsy reports. Nothing in that driveway happened in isolation. Nothing happened by coincidence. And the one thing detectives hadn't expected was how clearly the medical report echoed the tone of the voicemails, creating a line that connected Rachel's words to her actions in a way the law could not ignore. Detectives thought they understood the truth, until the medical report matched the tape, not the tears. When detectives made the decision to arrest Rachel Wade on the morning of April 15, 2009, they approached her with the calm, measured tone that comes after hours of reviewing evidence that cannot be ignored. And Rachel's face immediately shifted from confusion to panic as the cuffs clicked around her wrists. She cried and repeated, "I didn't mean to kill her, I swear, I didn't mean for this to happen." But officers had heard her earlier statements. They had listened to the voicemails, and they understood that her emotions in that moment didn't erase what had unfolded in the driveway. As they escorted her to the patrol car, she looked back at her friends with wide eyes, asking through tears, "Please tell them I was scared." But the witnesses who watched the stabbing had already given their statements. The neighborhood that had been quiet the night before was filled with parents standing at their doors, whispering to each other, turning their attention from Rachel to the ambulance route where Sarah had taken her final breath. And as the cruiser pulled away, the entire street felt the weight of a tragedy no one fully understood yet. But everyone sensed was only beginning. News of the arrest spread quickly through Pinellas Park, reaching parents who had watched both girls grow up and now struggled to make sense of how teenage rivalry had ended with one life lost and another changed forever. Teachers at Dixie Hollins High School were heartbroken, speaking quietly about the vibrant girl who would never walk into their classrooms again. Friends of both teenagers were torn in ways that would follow them for years, some grieving the friend they lost, others trying to understand how Rachel, someone they had eaten lunch with and laughed with, could now be facing a murder charge. At Sarah's home, family members sat in silence with a kind of grief that settles into the walls, each one replaying her last moments and the phone calls that told them she was gone. And throughout the community, a sense of disbelief hung in the air as people tried to reconcile the ordinary lives of these girls with the gravity of the crime. As attorneys stepped into the case, Rachel's defense team quickly signaled they would argue Florida's Stand Your Ground statute, insisting she acted in self-defense after believing Sarah intended to hit her with the car. They leaned on Rachel's statements to detectives, quoting her words, "She tried to run me over," and building their strategy around portraying her as a frightened girl reacting to a threat. The prosecution, however, came prepared with the timeline of escalating hostility, the months of MySpace arguments, the eyewitness accounts, and the recordings of Rachel's own voice to counter that claim. They argued that the threats were not impulsive, that Rachel's anger had been documented clearly in her messages, and that the stabbing matched an intentional forward motion inconsistent with self-defense. Both sides sharpened their arguments behind the scenes, knowing a jury would have to sort through teenage emotion and adult consequences. Behind the courtroom walls, two families lived inside opposite kinds of heartbreak, one grieving the daughter they would bury, and the other fearing the sentence their daughter might face. Sarah's parents spent their days giving statements, planning a funeral, and trying to understand how a rivalry pushed by jealousy had ended in something so final. Rachel's family privately struggled with the reality that their daughter, only 19, might never come home, and they asked themselves how she had reached a moment where picking up a knife seemed like an option. Friends were caught in the middle of a tragedy fueled by emotional manipulation, the kind that comes when a teenager like Josh Camacho plays into the insecurities of more than one girl and sets off a conflict nobody can control. Detectives later said that in many ways this was an American tragedy, two young women drawn into a rivalry they didn't have the maturity or guidance to navigate. And by the time the courthouse prepared for pretrial motions, the emotional divide in the community had become impossible to ignore. The most pivotal moment before trial came when the state attorney's office announced that they would be playing every one of Rachel's voicemails in open court, including the message where she said, "I'm going to murder you," and the warning, "You better watch your back." Attorneys and detectives gathered in the courtroom for the pretrial hearing, and as the judge approved the recordings as evidence, the room grew noticeably tense. Reporters scribbled notes quickly, parents tightened their grip on tissues, and those who had seen the case evolve over the months understood exactly how devastating those recordings would be once the jury heard them. One prosecutor remarked quietly, "The tape is its own witness," and that line circulated through the hallway as people stepped outside to catch their breath. The courtroom was no longer a place for arguments alone. It was now a place where the spoken past would be resurrected in front of 12 strangers. The anticipation leading up to the first day of trial was felt in every corner of the courthouse, and the shift from investigation to prosecution was almost physical, like a curtain being pulled open for something no one could turn away from. People filled the benches early, whispering to each other about what they expected to hear, and families sat on opposite sides of the aisle, separated by more than just space. The attorneys straightened their files and adjusted their notes, preparing to show the jury not only the events of April 14th, but the months leading up to it. And as the bailiff opened the doors to let everyone inside, the air tightened with a tension that wrapped around every person in that room. When the courtroom doors opened, no one was ready for how quickly the tears would turn into evidence. The first morning of trial in July 2010 began with a tension that settled deep into the wood of the courtroom benches, a heaviness that everyone could feel as the clerk announced, "State of Florida versus Rachel Marie Wade." 12 jurors watched Rachel enter wearing a simple blouse, her shoulders shaking as she wiped her face, trying to hold herself together while knowing the recordings of her own voice would soon fill the room. Prosecutors opened by telling the jury, "This case is about choices, anger, and consequences," and then they began presenting the timeline built from phone records, witness statements, and digital messages collected over months. Expert witnesses were called one after another, explaining the depth of the fatal wound and the angle that drove it straight into Sarah's heart, an angle that one forensic expert testified showed a forward, downward motion, consistent with purposeful force. The jury listened quietly, and as each detail layered over the last, the picture grew sharper, leaving less for interpretation and more for truth. Prosecutors moved carefully through the evidence, showing the jury the sequence of arguments on MySpace, the digital trail of jealous messages, and the chain of events leading up to April 14th, 2009. They brought in eyewitnesses who described seeing Rachel step towards Sarah, not away, and each witness seemed to confirm the same fundamental pattern. Rachel struck, Sarah collapsed, and the moment ended with words no one has forgotten. Then the moment everyone braced for arrived when the state pressed play on Rachel's recorded voicemails, her voice echoing loudly through the courtroom speakers as she said, "You better watch your back," followed by the chilling message, "I'm going to murder you." The sound of her own voice, sharp and angry, hit the room with a force that even seasoned court staff felt. And in that instant, every person in the courtroom felt the collision between the teenager crying at the defense table and the teenager who left those messages only days before the stabbing. The defense struggled to hold on to their narrative as Rachel sat crying beside her attorney, shaking her head softly while he argued that she believed Sarah was going to hit her with the car, and that she reacted out of fear rather than anger. He reminded the jury that Rachel said repeatedly, "I didn't mean to kill her," and that she claimed Sarah's car lurched toward her in the driveway. But the prosecution countered with physical diagrams of the scene and testimony from multiple witnesses who said Sarah never drove at Rachel at all. She had stepped out of the vehicle calmly before the confrontation began. The defense attempted to highlight Rachel's youth, her emotional instability, and the confusion of the moment. But every time they tried to build momentum, the prosecution circled back to the messages, the threats, the knife, and the medical evidence. By the second week of trial, even Rachel's attorney began to slow, realizing the evidence had boxed them in from every side. The emotional toll on both families reached its peak during the playback of the voicemails, when Sarah's mother quietly stood from her seat, covered her mouth, and walked out of the courtroom as tears rolled down her face. The sound of the door closing behind her was louder than it should have been, a stark reminder that the courtroom was not just a place for legal arguments. It was the place where her daughter's last moments were dissected piece by piece. Rachel sat with her head bowed, shoulders trembling, as her own voice echoed repeatedly across the judge's bench. the words she once said so freely now forming the backbone of the state's argument. Reporters who later wrote about the trial noted that Rachel appeared devastated each time the recordings played, as though she didn't recognize the girl speaking. And as Sarah's father held his wife in the hallway, the jury remained inside listening to every second, knowing they were hearing the final pieces of a story that would end with a life sentence for one family and a prison sentence for another. Closing arguments brought the room to a breathless stillness as prosecutors told the jury, this was not an accident. This was the result of anger that lasted for months, spoken in her own words, acted out in her own hands. The defense responded with a plea for mercy, asking the jury to consider Rachel's age, her fear, and the emotional chaos that led to that night, insisting again that she never intended for any of this to happen. But as the attorneys finished, the jurors looked at each other with expressions that suggested the weight of the evidence was already sitting heavily on their decision. When they left to deliberate, the families sat in opposite corners of the courtroom, neither side speaking, neither side moving much, just bracing themselves for the outcome. It didn't take long, just under 3 hours, before the bailiff announced, "The jury has reached a verdict." Everyone stood as the jury filed in, and Rachel clutched the edge of the defense table as the foreperson handed the verdict form to the judge. The courtroom fell so silent that even the sound of papers shifting could be heard. When the judge read, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Rachel Marie Wade, guilty of second-degree murder," Rachel's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed into her chair, crying hard enough that her attorney had to hold her upright. On the other side of the room, Sarah's family closed their eyes and reached for each other's hands, not in celebration, but in a heavy, quiet acknowledgement that the court had recognized their daughter's life. And while Rachel sobbed, repeating softly, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry," the weight of the verdict settled over the courtroom like a final breath. She faced prison, but Sarah's family faced the rest of their lives. When the verdict was read and the courtroom finally emptied, the real weight of what happened didn't fall on the lawyers or the reporters. It fell on the families who had to go home and face a life that no longer matched the world they lived in just a year earlier. Within weeks of sentencing, Rachel Wade was transferred to the Florida Women's Prison System to begin serving her 27-year sentence, a number that meant she would likely spend all of her 20s and most of her 40s behind razor wire and concrete walls. She arrived at Lowell Correctional Institution wearing prison-issued clothing instead of the blazer she wore in court, and the young woman who once spent her days waitressing and checking MySpace now spent every hour under supervision, counted and cataloged like every other inmate. Former classmates spoke in interviews about how strange it felt to imagine Rachel in a cell, saying things like, "It's hard to picture her there, but this is what happened." And as she settled into the routine of waking at 4 a.m., lining up for head counts, and following strict schedules, the outside world kept moving without her. For Sarah's family, the world didn't move forward, not naturally. There was an empty seat at the dining table every holiday, a silence in the hallway where laughter used to echo, and a photo frame that held the same smile day after day, because no new moments would ever be added. Her mother kept her room exactly the way it was, from the clothes in her closet to the graduation plans she'd been excited about before everything stopped. Friends who once texted Sarah about weekend plans now walked across a graduation stage without her, leaving a chair empty in her memory while her family sat in the audience holding back tears. They looked at other students wearing caps and gowns, knowing that Sarah should have been one of them, and the weight of that truth settled in their hearts in a way no verdict could soften. And in the quiet moments, when the world wasn't watching, they remembered how she laughed, how she loved, and how quickly her life had been taken from them. Over time, the case grew into far more than a courtroom story. It became something teachers, counselors, and parents began discussing with teenagers across Florida. Schools used it in workshops about dating violence, emotional pressure, and digital harassment, explaining how online arguments can escalate into real danger. Counselors showed students how MySpace conflicts and threats weren't just part of teen drama, but warning signs that adults needed to step into sooner. Parents brought the case up at dinner tables, urging their children to speak up when relationships start to feel unsafe, telling them stories of how quickly jealousy can cloud judgment. Communities pointed to Rachel and Sarah as examples of what happens when young people are left to sort out intense emotions without enough guidance or boundaries. And as the years went by, the story became part of a statewide discussion about emotional safety for teenagers living in a world where online hostility can grow faster than real support. The impact of the case didn't stop in schools. It spread into conversations across the country as MySpace faded and new platforms emerged, raising questions about how digital conflict, threats, and emotional manipulation can escalate in the lives of young people. Parents who once saw social media as harmless began taking online messages more seriously, understanding that what is posted in frustration can become evidence of intent later. Law enforcement agencies use the case as training material to show how digital footprints help reconstruct emotional escalation long before a crime occurs. Mental health professionals reference the story when explaining how unresolved jealousy and emotional dependence can push young people into impulsive decisions with lifelong consequences. And nationwide, families reevaluated what it meant to pay attention, not just to what teens say online, but how they say it, and how quickly their words can turn into action if no one intervenes. Media coverage continued to grow as well, keeping the case alive long after the trial ended. Documentaries highlighted both families, showing the human side of what looked at first like a simple headline, but was, in truth, a story filled with countless moments of hurt, confusion, and missed opportunities. Lifetime released a film inspired by the case, shifting details but keeping the core tragedy intact. Two young women caught in a rivalry that consumed them both. News specials revisited the story on anniversaries, interviewing detectives who still remembered the voicemails, the evidence, and the moment the verdict was read. Commentators used the case to talk about the pressures on teenage girls navigating complex relationships, especially when attention from one boy can become the match that lights emotional gasoline. And every time the case resurfaced, it reminded viewers how quickly one night can reshape the future of everyone involved. Inside prison walls, Rachel adapted to a reality she couldn't escape, becoming another inmate with a dock number and a schedule dictated by correctional officers. She took classes, worked assigned jobs, and kept mostly to herself, knowing that every year she spent inside was another year Sarah's family spent missing their daughter. Interviews and reports over the years mentioned how she told people she wished she could take that night back, how she regretted the conflict in the voicemails, and how she never expected things to go as far as they did. But apologies made years later could never reach the girl who lost her life or the family who had to live without her. Time passed slowly for Rachel, marked by count bells, commissary lists, and letters that arrived just often enough to remind her of the world beyond the fences. And every day she woke up, she was reminded that she was the only one from that night who still had a future to live, even if that future was confined behind bars. And so the story settles into its final truth. Two young women loved the same boy. Only one went home, and the other never will. Sarah had dreams, laughter, and morning light in her eyes, moments she never got to finish. Rachel had choices no teenager should have to face under, jealousy and emotional pressure, but choices she made all the same. And now their story stands as a reminder to every parent, every teacher, every teenager who hears it, that the line between anger and regret can be one moment wide, one decision deep, one phone call close. These were two girls who should have grown up, moved on, healed, and lived whole lives past this rivalry. But the world only got to keep one memory and one inmate. If this story moved you, share her name, because memory is its own kind of justice.